And on the line with us is our friend calling in from flyover country, our good friend, and glad to be on the, I'm happy that you're going to be on the last show. Renn, welcome back to the John Fredericks Show.
Thanks for having me on.
Hey, it's good to hear from you. How's everything out in flyover country?
Well, actually, I just got back to New York last night. I spent 2 weeks in Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, traveling around, a mix of visiting family and doing a little work. I'm writing an article about Grand Rapids, spent some time there. Mm-hmm. So you have to get out in the field and actually see these places. And so I'm from there, and I always enjoy spending time there. But now I'm back in a very frigid New York.
Well, did you like the lead-in I gave you?
Yeah, that was great. Huh? That was great. You always have the best music.
Well, thank you, Renn. I appreciate that. We always try to fit it with our guests. And the last article you wrote was what? I think it was December 4th, the What is the Future of Flyover? So what is the future, Renn? Let us know.
Well, there's been this kind of like a way of thinking about the economy, thinking about the country that says the coasts are doing great, you know, New York, D.C., Boston, San Francisco, Seattle, and that the interior is basically all opioids, is Rust Belt. It's kind of going down the tubes. People are voting for Trump because their communities are imploding, et cetera. And there is actually some truth in that. The coastal economies have done very well, especially in elite sectors. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to kind of talk about both the real problems, such as opioids, facing some of these communities, but also talk about some of the things that are going right. There are a lot of communities in the interior of the country that are actually booming, mm-hmm. and there are a lot of things going very well, and I think a lot of strengths for the nation there, and things that are very important to our nation to succeed, such as our agricultural industry, our industrial industries, which are basically based in these areas, that if we ended up losing those, would be, I would argue, devastating for our country.
Well, I think the prices would be high. Devastation, sure, but the price would be high. Where are you going to get all this agriculture from?
Right. Well, it's like, do you really want, well, our agricultural industry is doing pretty well, mm-hmm. but we certainly wouldn't want to be importing all our food from foreign countries, right? Because then they've sort of got you. Mm-hmm. And so I think the idea of having the ability to build things, which feeds directly into our military, among other things, is very important. You need to be able to, we can live without avocados from Mexico, but we need to be able to feed our people and build things that are important to our national security and to provide middle class jobs, which are something that those kinds of industries do. Agriculture doesn't employ a lot of people, but there's still quite a few people employed in manufacturing. You know,
Renn, I just had on two gentlemen from West Virginia. We were talking about some of the economic development going on in the Eastern Panhandle of West Virginia. But I didn't know until last year, I had no idea, that Berkeley County is like the capital of apples for the East Coast.
No, I didn't know that either.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a major export, apples from West Virginia. And I thought it was the majority of the apples on the East Coast. I thought they were from upstate New York, but that's just a variety of apples. But it is West Virginia. Berkeley County, West Virginia is like the apple. Everything is Apple Festival. October, it's just like, the pumpkin stuff. It's Apple Festival in October over at Berkeley County. How about the people? What's the feeling when you're speaking with the people, going to shops, getting a coffee, getting some food? What's the vibe with the people?
Well, I think it depends on where you are. Again, Grand Rapids, Michigan, for example, you think of Michigan, you think about a place that's really been in trouble. You mentioned Saginaw in that song. Saginaw is a deeply troubled city, but Grand Rapids is basically a boom town. Mm-hmm. It's growing its jobs faster than any other major city in the Midwest. The medical industry is doing well. There's, furniture companies there like Herman Miller and Steelcase. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of local billionaires that have put a lot of their money back into the town to redevelop it. And so you talk to people in Grand Rapids, they're very, very excited, very, very optimistic. I was also in Akron recently. Akron's kind of a middle city. It hasn't suffered the devastations of a Flint or a Youngstown, but it's not as booming as, say, a Grand Rapids. And the people there, I think, are cautiously optimistic. They see, they see signs that, housing is being invested in their city, their downtown, et cetera. But they're not claiming that everything is perfect. So I think a lot of it depends very much on the local conditions. Some even within the same state, there are communities that are thriving and there are ones that are kind of really struggling. And so I think a lot of this idea of the two-tier economy hasn't just played out between the coasts and kind of the interior. It's also between cities and counties inside of states. Even in a place like Indiana, where I'm from, there are many communities in Indiana that are doing extremely well. Columbus, Bloomington, Indianapolis, Lafayette, and there are others that are struggling.
What about Carmel? Is there a place, Carmel, in Indiana?
Carmel is a suburb of Indianapolis.
Right.
That's pretty much as nice as any major business suburb in the country. And you went there, you would think you're in San Diego or something. As nice as all the stuff is that they build there. A
lot of healthcare there, healthcare industry.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So, and then there are places near where I grew up. There was a place that had one of the nation's largest HIV crises because of opioids and injecting these prescription drugs like Opana. The county of 25,000 people had almost over 100 cases. I can't remember the exact one. It may have been almost 200 cases of HIV in only about 18 months. So they've kind of got that under control. But there is a huge problem with opioids in a lot of these places. So it really depends on where you're at and what's going on. You can go into North Dakota. They still have the fracking. So if you have a natural resource boom, if you have a university, if you have a major college base there, if you're a state capital, things are going pretty well. In some of these other places that are more remote, that were more purely industrial, very heavily dependent on a single employer, like Flint, Michigan, for example. Mm-hmm. Half its jobs were at GM, and they were mostly just factory jobs, and you lost over 90% of them. And that's a huge huge blow.
Sure.
I don't care who your leadership is, Democrat, Republican, et cetera. When you lose, when a company that employs half your people, eliminates over the course of several, couple decades, 90% of its jobs, you got a problem.
It's similar to like Rochester with Kodak, Eastman Kodak.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So some of these cities, and that's what you run into. Like if you go to Detroit, for example, everybody says, "Oh, Detroit is terrible." The fact is, there are tons of engineers in Detroit. Detroit is still the capital of the auto industry in North America.
Yes.
Even pretty much every foreign, German, Korean, Japanese auto supplier has their North American headquarters in Detroit.
When you fly in, Aaron, when you fly into the airport, you see the signs in English and Japanese.
Yeah. So they've got flights to Asia. The last I checked, they had more direct flights to Asia, nonstop flights to Asia than Chicago did. Right. So they have a lot of corporate headquarters. They have a lot of high-end things going on. Again, when you get into a Flint or a Youngstown, these were more branch plant cities. Mm-hmm. GM was actually founded in Flint, but it left in the 30s or something, I believe. But with these branch plant places that never had the big talent clusters, the white-collar workforce, the universities, they're the ones that have really struggled to reinvent themselves. Mm-hmm. Whereas the Clevelands and the Detroits have a lot of good things going on. The Cleveland Clinic is one of the world's premier medical facilities. People from the Middle East fly there all the time for medical care. So they've got things to rebuild around that aren't in some of these smaller cities.
Is Cincinnati continuing to have some gentrification?
Yeah, well, Cincinnati was a gigantic city in the 1830s. It was the Chicago of the Midwest before Chicago took that role. And it has an amazing collection of historic architecture. When you're in neighborhoods like over the Rhine, you feel like you're in Brooklyn. Mm-hmm. It's that dense and just unique. And so there's definitely been a lot of redevelopment there. Tons of corporate headquarters in Cincinnati, Procter & Gamble, Kroger, Cintas, the uniform company, many headquarters there. GE Aircraft Engines is there. General Electric also just opened a big back office operations center in downtown Cincinnati with about 1,000 people. So that's an example of a city that has, not without its problems, to be sure, but has tremendous potential and a lot of good things going on in it.
That's great. So are you happy to be home?
Yeah, it was a long trip. I have a 5-month-old son, so
Wow.
This was like our first big trip with him. 2 weeks, and he was great, and we had a great time. But it's also good to be back.
Well,
I think
congratulations on having a 2-month-old son. I didn't know you had a son. That's congratulations.
Yes. My first child, which is amazing. It's a great thing.
Great. That's great for you, Aaron. I want to thank you for coming back on the show, and our final show of the year, and we hope to have you on many more times next year.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Have a Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, sir.